So hello, and thank you for joining our Colorado River Management webinar. I'm your host, Abby Burk, the Western Rivers Outreach Specialist for Audubon Rockies, a regional office of the National Audubon Society. It is my privilege to introduce to you today our presenter, Jennifer Pitt. Jennifer is Director of the Colorado River Project at the National Audubon Society, where she focuses efforts to protect and restore freshwater and riparian habitats and reform water policy in the Colorado River Basin. She has worked with water users throughout the Colorado Basin to develop practical programs to restore river habitats and to dedicate water to critical environmental resources. Her expertise includes US-Mexico border environmental issues, the legal and policy framework for Colorado River management, water markets, and the science of river restoration. Before joining Audubon, Jennifer worked on protection and restoration of Colorado River Basin freshwater resources for 17 years at the Environmental Defense Fund. So thank you, Jennifer, for sharing your expertise with us today. Let's get right to it since we have lots to present to you today. Jennifer, can you advance one slide, please? Your phone lines have been muted since we have a good number of participants today. We will engage questions after the main presentation of today's webinar. Please use the chat feature on your screen to type your messages or questions directly to me. And you can do that throughout this whole session. Thanks again for joining, and let's dive in. So Jennifer, when you're ready, my friend, please go ahead.
Great, and thank you so much, Abby. It's really been exciting for me to join the National Audubon Society. My computer's talking to all of us right now. And as Abby said, I am a Colorado River water wonk. I've been working on Colorado River management issues for the environmental community for years. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my current perspective on where we are in terms of opportunities to make progress on river restoration. So I'm just going to start by making sure everybody knows what we're talking about here. The Colorado River Basin, it's about 244,000 square miles. Some of that basin is in the state of Colorado, as you can see on the map on your screens, and it starts up in the river starts up in the headwaters of the Rockies in Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, and drains down into the Gulf of California in Mexico. And I put these three pictures up, with the top one being the headwaters of the Colorado River in Rocky Mountain National Park, just up the road from where I'm sitting today in Boulder, Colorado. And a lot of people, well, some people know that that's where the Colorado River starts. And I would say on a global scale, if you ask people if they know anything about the Colorado River, most often what people will know about is that it's the river that carved the Grand Canyon. And what a lot of people don't know is that this river, this mighty river that carved the Grand Canyon, today trickles into the sand on the border between Arizona, the state of Arizona, and the state of Baja California in northwestern Mexico. The rivers of the Colorado River Basin are, of course, more than the main stem, and you can see some of those rivers here on the basin map on your screen. But there are, thousands of headwaters, creeks, and tributaries, and all flowing into the main stem, all of which make up the rivers of the basin, and all of which are critically important to fish and wildlife and to people across the basin. The Colorado River is kind of legendary in the West for being one of the world's most litigated and the world's most developed rivers. The graphic you see on the left was originally published in High Country News and is kind of an iconic image of the Colorado River, depicting it as a network of buckets and pipes, essentially conveying the message that it's been engineered into a water supply for different water users who are removing water from the river to put it to use. And in many ways, that is a fair representation of the river, and it's certainly the understanding of the Colorado River that I inherited when I started working on it for the conservation community. And I would say that behind this network of reservoirs and conveyance channels is a framework, a legal framework that has its origins in the late 19th century in both federal and state law that has been viewed by many water users, especially the conservation community, as fairly inflexible. And for those of you who've worked on water issues in the state of Colorado or elsewhere, you may know that at the state level, and I'd say it's true at the interstate and international level as well, and a challenge for folks interested in river health is that much of that law predates modern environmental law. And so while the Endangered Species Act does, of course, still apply in this basin, that is not a tool sufficient necessarily to achieve the kind of outcomes that we'd like to see for our rivers in terms of healthy flows, healthy habitat, adequate flows for recreation for our communities. So it has been perhaps viewed as a bit of a lost cause in the Colorado River Basin to be working on the health of this river. And in fact, a fellow named Philip Fradkin published a book called River No More back in the early 80s, commenting on this himself. I think his focus was largely on the lower basin of the Colorado River and on the delta, where the river really runs pool to pool instead of having any kind of natural flow hydrograph to it. But at any rate, this is kind of where the river has been, I'd say, in the popular imagination for quite a while. What's new, and it's not really new at this point, this graphic itself is already a handful of years old, but what's beginning to change reality in the Colorado River Basin is our understanding not only of our growing demands in the basin, that's always been true, but our growing understanding of climate change impact. So if you look at this graphic, which was published by the Federal Bureau of Reclamation in partnership with the 7 Colorado River Basin states back in 2012, on the left-hand side of the graphic you see historic, in other words, recorded actual water supply, the blue line, and water use expressed as a 10-year running average, the red line. And you can see that the blue line bounces around over time, which is a measure of the fact that there's always been a fair amount of interannual variability of Colorado River flows, which we know as sort of a lot of snow or not very much snow in the mountains on any given year. And of course, the red line with the increasing demands over time, so we're looking at the early 20s through about 2008 in the historic portion of this chart. You can just see this sort of inexorable growth in demands. And then what Reclamation and the state did was forecast future growth in demand on the right-hand side. The blurry nature of the line, I believe, is representing the uncertainty of that projection. But nonetheless, it seems to increase over time. And then the supply line, which is the blue line on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the projected future supply, where you see, first of all, huge uncertainty, and second of all, declining trend, and notably, even in the historic side of the chart, you see that the supply and the demand lines have crossed. And that understanding has really, by now, fully permeated the water management community in the Colorado River Basin. You know, like I said, this was first published in 2012. I think there was some amount of disbelief when it was first published, but over the last few years, with the persistence of drought in this basin, this message has gotten out. Supply is not as great as our demands, and the conclusion that any water manager will therefore reach is that our current water management system cannot hold. So that inflexible nature of our legal framework, which was the underpinning of our physical framework for managing the Colorado, has begun to show its weakness, and people are beginning to think about what changes need to be made, not because we in the environmental community have asked for changes that improve outcomes for river health, but because climate change and population growth are stressing this basin to a point where the status quo really cannot be maintained. So that's just sort of the big picture background leading into this talk, and what I'm going to do is spend a little time discussing, in probably a little too much detail, the current system status in the basin, move over to risk to water users. That's really the intersection of where the basin is hydrologically with what the law of the river, or what the different laws say about the positions of different water users, meaning different states and different classes of water users in the basin. And then shift to what some of the management approaches are that are emerging, including some that are in place today, intentionally created, surplus, the System Conservation Pilot Program, Minute 319, and then spend a little time on what my understanding is of what water managers are working on, and to put all of this into the lens of someone working to improve the health of rivers, I will try to identify for you where there may be opportunities in the implementation of these programs to make improvements on river health, and that is where I will end up with my conclusions. So, system status. Last time I flew over the Rockies, there was some snow out there. That was a few weeks ago. We did have a good start to our winter, but as anyone who's here in the state of Colorado with me knows, it has not been snowing for the last few weeks. What I pulled up for you here is a snowpack assessment from the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center. And what you see are a bunch of lines showing the water year, or we'll call it the snow year. So the median for the past 30 years is the purple line, which sits just below the average line for those past 30 years. So I guess it's not exactly 30 years, 1981 to 2010. So it's not the most recent 30 years, but that 30-year time frame. And you can see that typically during that 30-year time period, snowpack builds up till late March, and then we begin our runoff season, and the curve starts to head downward. What you see in the red line is 2015. Last year's snowpack did not build up as high as we saw in that more recent 30-year average or median. And the runoff period started earlier. You see the inflection of the red line starting down the curve sooner. We were very fortunate in the month of May. If you go out to where it says 5-1 on the bottom of the chart, and you see that the red line stabilizes for a few weeks, and people were calling that Miracle May. We actually got a fair amount of rain and some snow in the Rockies, and that helped to improve our water outlook. Where we are today is the green line. That's largely hiding under the other lines, but you can see it poking out underneath the purple line. I pulled this chart last Friday, so it's current as of last Friday. For a while, we were actually looking like we were up above the 30-year average, and you can see that in the green line peaking above the median lines. But for the last few weeks, as I said, we haven't had much snow, and that green line is now well underneath the 30-year average. So we're not sure yet what the rest of this spring's forecast looks like. But I'm spending this much time on this chart in part to sort of convey to all of you the importance of this year's weather. And it's important because it relates to the basin's water supply, and it also, I think, correlates. There's a strong correlation with what water managers are thinking about as appropriate water management actions. I mean, they've got their eye on reservoir storage, but they've also got their eye on what the prospects are for our snowpack in the mountains. And so it's always useful to check in on the water year. To put this in context, here you have a century's worth of natural flow data for the Colorado River Basin at Lee's Ferry, which is essentially the compact dividing point between the upper basin and the lower basin, and accounts for the vast majority of flows in the Colorado River Basin. And so the first thing to notice is that the blue bars, which represent the inflows in any given year, are kind of all over the place. And sometimes they're high and sometimes they're low. And that is this interannual variability in the Colorado River Basin. And that has been going on forever. What you see in the kind of greenish beige line is the cumulative average inflow, and you can see that early in the 20th century with fewer data points, to be sure. We were looking at an average inflow that looked to be maybe 17 or 18 million acre feet on an average annual basis. And over time, that line has declined to around 15 million acre feet. And then what you see with the black line is a 10-year running average that shows you a little bit more about the recent climate history. And you can see that our recent average is well below that 15 million acre foot point. So this is just a view of sort of historically where we are in terms of inflows and Colorado River water supply. However, another view of the basin is what is available to us in storage. Now, think back to that graphic I showed you from High Country News with the buckets and the faucets. Here's another representation showing you the buckets and how much water we have in the buckets. One thing to know about the Colorado River that's actually quite distinctive is that on this river, our total reservoir storage capacity is 4 times the annual average flow of the river. And that is one of the highest, if not the highest, storage to flow ratios on a river in the world. It is quite unusual to have that much storage. Another thing to note is that 80% of the Colorado River's total storage capacity are in 2 big reservoirs, Lake Powell, which is the upper basin's reservoir, Mead, which is lower basin's reservoir. And then to note that today, system storage is at 40% full. System storage was more or less 100% full in the year 2000. We've been in drought since then. And at this point, we have sipped our way through that reservoir storage to the point where they are sitting at about 40% of capacity. So what does that mean in terms of, what does all of this mean in terms of risk to water users? So I'm going to back up and give a little bit of basics. I don't know all of you who are on the phone, and it may be that I'm talking to a bunch of Colorado River scholars, and if that's the case, just be patient with me. But there are some principles that are kind of fundamental to Western water law and management that inform all of this. So one is that beneficial use is required for water, and you can't be, if you have a water right, but you're not putting it to beneficial use. In other words, you're not using it for irrigating agriculture or using it to deliver to an urban population or using it to develop an industrial project. It is not your water to use, and it must remain in the river for the next water right owner to make use of. Another fundamental principle is prior appropriation. You might have heard of that as first in time, first in right, and what that means is that the water rights that were developed earliest chronologically, like in the year, say an 1870 water right, will be satisfied or will have its water delivered to it before a 1910 water right. In a year when there's enough water for everybody, that doesn't really make a difference. In a year when there's not enough water for everybody, the senior water right, by law, receives its water to the extent possible, while the junior water right is denied. So in other words, if our water year is 75% of average, and say, or 75% of what we need to fulfill everybody's water rights, it's not that we're shorting everybody by 25%, but rather that the water rights representing 75% of the total volume will be satisfied, and then the junior water rights representing the last 25% will not be satisfied. And that's pretty fundamental, and it comes from this legal framework comes out of our mining history here in the West. And I put a little photo of water developments up high in the Rockies somewhere for a mine on the left there to just show you where that comes from. And if this fellow who'd put in his pipe to run his mine, if somebody had developed a mine uphill from him, after he got there, he would have been deprived his water rights until we had a legal structure that assured that because of the date that he put his water development in, he would be getting his water rights. So that's where that comes from historically. And I had to put the other picture in on the bottom right of your screen, which is actually the Grand Ditch here in Colorado, up in the outskirts of Rocky Mountain National Park, and it shows one of the earliest diversions out of the headwaters of the Colorado River. And I wanted to put that there also just to remind you what some of our water diversions do to rivers. That cut, which is feeding a canal across the side of the mountain there, is removing upwards of 70% of the runoff from that slope from the watershed below and diverting it to water users elsewhere. So that history has quite a lot of implications. At any rate, to keep us moving, another fundamental point I wanted to make is that Colorado River management is decentralized based on the allocations that are made in interstate compacts, international treaty, state water law, which then results in water rights being owned by different water users. And there is a role for the federal government in Colorado River management, but it is not the ultimate authority on how the river is operated. And because it is so decentralized, then it is through consensus that we see change in how the water resources and the rivers in this basin are managed. So what I want to do is go through through some of the different classes of users or by geography to talk about what kind of risks they face as our water supply is projected to decline in the future. So one that you may have heard about is the risk under the Colorado River Compact, which was signed in 1922, to the upper basin in particular. So the upper basin, according to the compact, and if I wasn't clear earlier, the upper basin is Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah. Those four states must deliver 75 million acre-feet in any 10-year period to the lower basin. And some would argue that they actually have to deliver 82.3 or 82.5 million acre-feet to the lower basin, a story for another day. But at any rate, what I wanted to be clear about is that the upper basin has never failed to make those deliveries. So what you see here is a chart showing upper basin deliveries to the lower basin. The blue lines represent the annual delivery every year from 1990 up to the present, and the orange lines show the 10-year running average starting in the late 90s. So, and then what I've marked out with the bars that go running across are the line at 75 million acre-feet and 82.3 million acre-feet. And you can see that we've certainly not gotten close for the upper basin hitting that 75 million acre-foot line. We've gotten a little bit close to that 82.6 3 line, but at any rate, the upper basin has never missed that delivery. But over time, if the snowpack continues to decline, if the hydrologic cycle through climate change changes to the point where there's less flow in this river, the upper basin's ability to deliver that water to the lower basin becomes compromised. And this is a graphic that a fellow named Doug Kinney over at the University of Colorado came up with, and I think it's really instructive in showing what the risk is to the upper basin. So what you see on the left axis is water availability in the to the upper basin, and what you see on the bottom axis is the average leaf area flow. So that's how much water is in the basin. That's sort of akin to that, or you can relate that to the century of water data that I showed to you. So if there's 15 million acre feet in the basin at natural flow in any given year, there's enough water for the lower basin to be getting there, 7.5 million acre feet in any given year, and there's enough water for the upper basin to be using close to 7 million acre feet. It's not perfectly 7.5 million acre feet because there are evaporative losses. But what happens over time, if you follow the bottom axis across, is if your average decreases over time, the water that's available to the upper basin will decrease. And so that dashed line diagonally running down the middle of the graph shows water that is remaining available to the upper basin after that lower basin water delivery obligation has been met. And Doug Kinney terms this the upper basin climate change squeeze. So in other words, as the total water supply in the Colorado River Basin declines with climate change, the real heavy impact as that decline becomes more severe is borne by the upper basin, at least under a sort of strict reading of the way that the Colorado River Compact works. But that's somewhat, as I showed you here, we're not close yet to missing those compact delivery obligations. So this is sort of a long-term concern for the upper basin. What's of late been more of a concern is the risk that the dry years we've been having are beginning to impact hydropower generation at Lake Powell. And this is of particular concern because not only are there upper basin water users who receive subsidized power from the contracts at Lake Powell, but also, and I think more importantly, the endangered species compliance programs in the upper basin that allow upper basin water users to continue to divert their water are subsidized and funded quite completely by hydropower revenues. So as hydropower revenues are projected to disappear, these water users are facing a fairly significant dollar cost to continuing to implement the endangered species compliance that allows them to legally continue to divert the water that they use. And so this chart is just showing that if you were to project a continued drought into the future, so this is a future projection of dry years, much similar to what we've had in the last 20 years, 88 to 2007, you find that about 20% of the time, Powell is below the power pool, in other words, unable to generate any hydropower. And so that has presented itself as a risk to upper basin water users, and they have begun to think about whether or not they need to take action to deal with it. When you look at other water users and risk, when you look at other water users and risk in the basin, you find in the lower basin in Mexico that the risks are real and present as well. So if you go back to look at the 1944 treaty that gives Mexico their allocation to Colorado River water, you find that there the language says Mexico will share in Colorado River shortages proportionately in times of extraordinary drought. But it doesn't say proportionately with whom, and it doesn't define what is extraordinary drought. And so there's uncertainty in that language, and yet Mexico sits downstream from the United States where all the reservoirs are. So Mexico is facing a lot of uncertainty about whether or not there would be an enforced shortage just imposed upon them unilaterally, or whether there would be some effort to define what their shortage would be. In the lower basin states, which are Arizona, California, and Nevada, the 1968 Colorado River Basin Project Act basically was a deal whereby Arizona got money to build the Central Arizona Project, their major diversion off the Colorado River, and they ended up accepting that their water rate would be junior to California's in exchange for the permission to build that project and receive federal funding to subsidize it. So they take the first shortage in the lower basin, and that goes back to that concept of prior appropriations that I mentioned earlier. Another big risk to water users is actually in California. In 2003, Colorado River water users agreed to something called the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which ended up quantifying their water rights, but also was the underpinning for, in fact, what is the world's, I think, biggest ag to urban water transfer from the Imperial Irrigation District over to the San Diego County Water Authority. And in the middle of that transfer is one of the West's largest inland water bodies, the Salton Sea. And the Salton Sea ends up being the linchpin to this current water transfer and to really any future Colorado River water transfers, because as water moves from the Imperial Irrigation District, the Salton Sea, which has been living on return flows from Imperial's water use, the Salton Sea is also starved of its inflows. The shoreline drops, habitat is compromised, communities are exposed. The communities of people who live around there begin to see increased exposure to fugitive dust emissions as the lake bed playa increasingly is exposed. So we see that the sea is actually not really sustainable under today's agreements, and there may be increased risk to the sea in the future. Another piece of the legal framework and the sort of law of the river framework that defines risk to water users was set up in 2007 with what are called the Interim Operating Guidelines that for the first time put on to paper and into formal rule what would happen in the event of shortages in the lower Colorado River Basin. So the Secretary of Interior has always been authorized to impose shortages. This was an attempt to provide greater certainty to water users by outlining the terms and rules of these shortages so that they were understood by all and provided certainty. So essentially what those rules say is as water in storage at Lake Mead declines, and remember Lake Mead is one of those two big Colorado River reservoirs, when it gets to 1075, which is 1,075 feet above mean sea level, which is apropos of nothing but something that our people can measure. but it doesn't really relate to, it's not that the Salton Sea, or sorry, it's not that Lake Mead is filled up from sea level, but simply that that's a measurement on the landscape. At any rate, once the water in storage declines to that level, there are some prescribed shortages for lower basin water users. So it says that Nevada would take a shortage of 13,000 acre feet. And in fact, there's been a deal since then between Arizona and Nevada, whereby Arizona will absorb that shortage. Arizona's shortage is 320,000 acre feet. If you add in the Nevada shortage, it's actually up to 333,000 acre feet. And that is actually borne by the Central Arizona Project, CEP here, principally by their ag users. California does not take a shortage under these rules. And in the original 2007 guidelines, Mexico did not take, the domestic guidelines for river management did not prescribe a shortage for Mexico, but subsequently there's been an agreement with Mexico called Minute 319, and I'll come back to that a little later. And in that agreement, Mexico agreed to take a sort of voluntary shortage of 50,000 acre feet when Mead hits 1075. As the lake continues to decline, as Lake Mead continues to decline 25 feet down to elevation 1050, those shortage volumes all increase. As Mead hits 1025, they increase again, and actually the rules say at that point the states need to reconsult with each other and the Secretary of Interior, because at that point they're perilously close to Mead being at elevation 1,000, which they have all, the water users have all in the lower basin have always wanted to protect, because as you start slipping below elevation 1,000, your ability to send water past the dam becomes compromised. In other words, you may not be able to release water to your lower basin water users, and we have tens of millions of people relying on water deliveries from Lake Mead, and that is a situation that no water manager, federal, state, or otherwise, wants to contemplate. What we have learned since 2007 is that the volumes that are tied to those shortage elevations are not enough to stall the continued decline of Mead if you assume that we're living in a world with climate change or extended drought or whatever it is that we're in right now. The shortage volumes do not appear to stem the losses or the declining elevations at Mead. So I want to walk you through that just a little bit in terms of what kind of risk lower basin water users are facing. So this is a chart that just shows Mead's elevation at the end, and I guess it's end of month, but it shows you that by the end of 2015, all the way on the right-hand side of the graph, we are just a hairline above 1075. I believe we ended calendar year 2015 at elevation 1082. So that's about 7 feet above 1075, very close to that first shortage declaration. Shortage doesn't get declared until there's a projection from an August study for an end-of-year elevation. So the fact that the lake has dropped briefly but below 1075 does not mean there's been a shortage declaration yet, but what you can see is that we are very, very close to that point. Part of what's driving Lake Mead down is not only the fact that we're seeing declining inflows from the upper basin because of climate change and extended drought, but also because we seem to have a bit of a water budget problem in the lower basin. So if you look at their inflows, 8.23 on an average annual basis from the upper basin plus side inflows equals about a 9 million acre foot inflow. Outflow being delivered to Arizona, California, and Nevada plus Mexico equaling about 9.6 million acre feet. Evaporative losses at about 600,000 acre-feet, leaves you with a balance of about 1.2 million acre-foot deficit on an average annual basis. And that is what has increasingly become known as the lower basin structural deficit. And what that means is that with only the basic or sort of minimum inflow of 8.23 from the upper basin into Lake Mead on an average annual basis, Lake Mead is set up to decline by about 12 feet every year. It's a deficit spending situation. So that has, in the last few years, become of paramount concern to lower basin water users and water managers who are looking at trying to avoid the continued decline of Lake Mead. Another view of what they're looking at in the lower basin has to, again, look at the recent past. We know that the long-term average flow in the Colorado River Basin has been about 15 million acre-feet, as depicted by the red line moving across this graph, which is the average. But if you look at just the last 15 years and project that onto the future, much as they did in the upper basin, and here we have it defined as a stress test period. And I can say, if you look at the little chart on the bottom, the median flow over that stress test period from about 1988 to 2012 or 1987 to 2012 is 12.3 million acre-feet. So well below the long-term average of about 14.6 to 15 million acre-feet. If you then take that stress test period and forecast into the future what your probabilities are for lake levels at Mead, which translate into what your probability is for being in a shortage condition in the lower basin, you can see some pretty stark results. So what this chart shows you, first of all, there's a lot of information here, so I'm going to try to walk you through it. On the horizontal axis, you can see numbers corresponding to the lake elevation. So I have circled here 1075, 1050, and 1025, and you can see that going across the chart there are bars showing you where those elevations are. So those 1075, again, is where the first shortage is implemented. 1050, the second shortage tier. 1025, that's the third shortage tier. And at 1025, you are very concerned about a decline towards the point that you will no longer be able to release water out of Lake Mead. So with the stress test forecast, in other words, repeating the last 25 years of hydrology into the future, from where we are today, the median forecast is that blue line, and I've pointed it out to you with an arrow. And what you can see is by 2018, the median forecast is to be in a shortage below 1075, and basically we don't see any recovery, we just see a continued decline. The purple line below the median line is the 25th percentile. So in other words, 75% of your future probabilities are that you are above that line, but 25% of your probability for your future conditions is below that line. And with that line, you dip down below Mead elevation 1050 by the year 2019, and the decline continues, and you're by about 2023 hovering around 1025. So, and then the final line, which is the lowest line, which is the 10th percentile, meaning there's only a 10% probability you could be here, but nonetheless, some probability that you could be well below Mead 1000, even by as soon as 2020, and that is of great concern to lower basin water managers. So they've got their eye on this. and this will inform some of what I'm going to switch to talking about in just a moment. But I didn't want to leave the discussion of risk without touching on the issue of risk to the environment, which is very real, and those risks have been borne out, those impacts have been borne out largely because we don't have a legal framework that protects our rivers and freshwater environments other than the Endangered Species Act. So what we've seen is that the delta of the Colorado River is already largely desiccated. We've seen what happens as we have diminished flows in the upper basin tributaries, and that risk will get only greater as climate change and extended drought impacts become more acute in the future. We also know that some ag to urban water transfers can decrease environmental water supply, as in the case of the Salton Sea that I touched on briefly. And I feel that it's pretty safe to say that it's very hard to get political leaders to address environmental concerns, freshwater environmental concerns, if their perception is that they're in a water supply crisis for their populations of people. So there's a great risk to freshwater resources that we may not have even thought about if our political leaders are presented with circumstances that they believe amount to a crisis. It's very hard for them to justify spending their time or their resources on addressing environmental water needs in that case. So that's all kind of dismal, but I wanted to kind of shift now into what we are seeing the water management community is doing about all of this, and to kind of take you quickly through their solution set. So in 2007, they implemented a solution called intentionally created surplus that has resulted in many extra feet of water being stored at Lake Mead. So this is 2014's most recent year of data, and we have, I think, about 11 extra feet of water being stored at Mead by the end of the year. So they are, they're beginning to implement new rules that allow them to bank water in Mead. In 2012, we saw the U.S. and Mexico Interminute 319, which, in addition to signing up Mexico to some certain terms for a shortage agreement, also has the U.S. investing in water conservation and had a very unique feature, which was U.S. and Mexican commitment to providing water and other resources for restoration to the Colorado River Delta. And there is a commitment to renegotiate a longer-term agreement. This one expires in 2017. And that's just a picture of some of the water deliveries under that agreement. In 2014, lower basin states entered a memorandum of understanding with each other and the federal government, saying that they would make their best efforts to leave more water in Mead, probably through the water banking mechanism of intentionally created surplus, so that they can call on it again. But they, by 2017, are trying to store a total of 845,000 acre feet additional in Mead to try to shore up reservoir elevations there. In 2014, they also began to implement a program called the System Conservation Pilot Program, whereby municipal water users and the federal government have pooled money to pay water users to conserve. And in the upper basin, and principally in Colorado and Wyoming, that is a pot of money amounting to about $2.25 million, and is being spent on projects that are largely partnerships between irrigators and environmental groups, PNC, Nature Conservancy, and Drought Unlimited principally. And they are implementing fallowing projects, but also figuring out ways to use that money to invest in irrigation infrastructure, such that the collateral benefits of these projects include in-stream flows, in some cases habitat improvements, as well as irrigation infrastructure upgrades that give water users increasing flexibility in the future to reduce water usage but continue to stay in business. So some habitat benefit coming out of this program. So the big question is what's next, and there's been a challenge from the Department of Interior saying El Nino is not a drought strategy, and in fact, we don't know if El Nino is really going to pan out in the Upper Basin this year. What if the current drought were to continue into the future? So they've been looking at some of those same modeling runs that I showed you. They've asked the states to have a plan in place by 2016 so that they, as the feds, don't have to use what limited authorities they have to try to impose one. And so the goal for the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin is to adopt drought contingency plans that reduce the risk of losing power production at Powell and of mead elevations that preclude water deliveries from into the Lower Basin. In the Upper Basin, what's being considered are extended operations of some of the reservoirs, early releases from those reservoirs, kind of a short-term fix, but could actually result in environmental flows depending on how that water is released from Upper Basin reservoirs. And they're also exploring ideas about how demand management might be implemented. So looking at those system conservation pilots and other opportunities to reduce demands in ways that conceivably could produce environmental flow benefits as well. In the Lower Basin, they're looking at minimizing the risk of mead elevation too low for water delivery. Arizona is likely to be facing larger shortage volumes than we see written out in the 2007 guidelines. And we know that they need some in-state agreements to avert the perception of crisis. If we cannot avoid a sense of crisis in water management in Arizona, California, as I mentioned, the existing transfer agreements between ag and urban users in Southern California require a solution to the Salton Sea. And it's possible that these looming Colorado River shortages could bring California to the table in a way that they are sharing in some of those shortages. They are not yet, but they may sometime in the future. And if that's the case, the shortage cannot be imposed or is unlikely to be imposed on their urban users with a junior water right. So you can see out in the future the possibility of additional ag to urban water transfers amongst California's Colorado River water users, requiring an even larger solution for the Salton Sea. And finally, I just wanted to touch on the USMexico Colorado River Agreement that expires in 2017. Because the U.S. federal government and the states are committed to keeping Mexico in a certain agreement over shortages, there's likely to be a continued quid pro quo in that agreement that provides benefits to Mexico for the environment, including funding for water conservation, mead storage, and commitments to flows and dollars for restoration in the Colorado River Delta. So quick conclusions, and I know I'm probably a little over time here. I apologize for that. I am led to believe that it is possible to consider the environment in these proactive agreements as water users are facing unprecedented probabilities of shortages. The upper basin's demand reduction can be managed to improve environmental flows. California's shortages will require a solution for the Salton Sea. I'm not saying there will be California shortages, but if there are California shortages in the future, and certainly even today's ag to urban transfer agreements require a solution for the Salton Sea. In Arizona, their increased exposure to shortages that is likely to pan out in the next few years implicate new in-state agreements required to avert a sense of water shortage crisis. And we are going to need that to be able to focus on any environmental flow issues in that state. And finally, Mexico has demonstrated a willingness to agree to proportional shortages in exchange for a package of benefits that includes environmental restoration. So I'll leave you with this image of the Colorado River, which is one that I love because when you look at it, in the graphic here, it says, "Behold the mighty Colorado River," and it's somewhat ironic, of course. It shows the Colorado River on the sands down in the delta, and it conveys a sense of shortage. That's not a mighty river. And yet, what you're actually looking at in this photograph is the flow of water that the U.S. and Mexico agreed to deliver under that recent Colorado River Agreement. So what you're looking at there is an unprecedented delivery of environmental flows. And that was only made possible because of the increased concern that water managers have over impending water supply crisis and shortages, leading them to think about new arrangements for water management that increase flexibility in river management and open up opportunities for environmental flow delivery. So I will leave it there, and Abby, ask if you have any questions that have come in.
Great. Jennifer, thank you so much for that super presentation. I really appreciate your time preparing and presenting for us today. We've had several questions come in that have just been really outstanding, and you've gotten people really thinking, and that's perfect. I'd like to stop. We just have a few moments for questions, so I'm going to consolidate a couple of the questions into kind of more of a conglomerate. So the first one I'd like to ask you, there were several questions about states such as Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado that are looking to develop or store more Colorado River water within their compact entitlement. And so there are some questions about how this affects lake levels, how this affects lower basins, and since we're already in structural deficit, how could future Colorado River water actually be developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great question. And, you know, under the terms of the compact in many ways was written the way it was to preserve the right of the upper basin states to develop at a slower pace. Even back in the 20s, they saw Southern California developing fast, and they knew that the lower basin would develop first. So the upper basin states look at the compact and they say, we might be out of water in this river. We get it. We know there's no water flowing down to the delta, but the compact preserves our right to develop our share in the future, and it may result in increasing shortages in the lower basin, and so be it. That's the way they're going to have to figure out how to adapt to that. I think the piece of the puzzle that is only more recently being contemplated by upper basin states is that with their obligation to deliver either 75 million acre feet every 10 years or 82.3 million acre feet every 10 years, if supply declines sufficiently that they can't meet that obligation, they're going to have to curtail uses in the upper basin states themselves in order to achieve those compact deliveries. And one has to presume that new storage, new diversions in these upper basin states amount to their junior diversions. So when you start thinking about a new Lake Powell pipeline or a new Green River storage project, you have to consider how much of the time will there actually be water available to provide to that diversion. And even if, then you can say, well, maybe they're going to go firm it through some sort of dry year lease agreement with irrigators someplace. Then that, simply displaces the water shortage elsewhere in the state. But I think one thing that people are looking at in terms of how the economics for these new diversions work out is how often will there be water to actually keep them full? How often will you have to be buying a replacement supply? And do the economics add up when you're in that kind of future condition?
Exactly. Great. Thank you very much. And I want to let folks know we're having questions come in like crazy. So please make sure that you take down Jennifer's and also my email. And we're happy to discuss these afterwards. But we've got time for just one more question, and I really love this one from Bonnie. If the federal government were listening, what would you ask for?
That's a great question. And I will say, let me just start out and say, I think the federal government is listening pretty closely right now, and the reason they're not acting unilaterally to sort of take management into their own hands is that there's a strong sort of federalism dynamic at play where the federal government doesn't actually own any of the Colorado River's water. The states do, and Mexico does. So the federal government really has to do its management in partnership with all of those other stakeholders. And, you know, not just the states, but the water rights holders as well. You know, I think that there is real interest, first of all, in having the federal government play a role in helping with demand management programs. And we've already seen some federal dollars go there. And I know that there's been a run at trying to get more dollars from the appropriators to help pay for those demand management programs. And that's something where water users and conservation voices are largely aligned because those demand management programs can result in positive outcomes for healthy rivers. And they can also result in stabilized water supply in our reservoirs. So it's kind of a win-win, but we need to figure out how to pay for it. So I don't think, you know, the appropriators are not the administration, it's Congress, and I'm not sure they're listening. But I think if they were listening, I would ask them to pay attention to this unified voice from the water users and the conservation community.
Absolutely. No, Jennifer, thank you so much. And again, I want to encourage folks, you have just given some outstanding questions here within our chat feature. Please forward them on to Jennifer and myself. We'd be happy to answer these questions. And so, Jennifer, could you click just one more for me, please? And I want to thank Jennifer for all her work in preparing for this great webinar and her work on behalf of rivers. And I would also like to extend an invitation to you. If you are not already a member of Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network, to please join. It's a great way to stay informed on future webinars, collaborative engagement opportunities, and so much more. So next up, we have our very last installment of our winter webinar series on March 16th. It's Water-Wise Landscaping, Good for People, Birds, and Rivers, presented by Jamie Weiss of Audubon Rockies. And lastly, I truly want to thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us. We hope you found this information useful. As always, there's more to come, and we hope you join us again, and have a great rest of your day. And again, Jen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Abby.